Hey, Dr. O here, and today I'd like to talk about how neurons create communication. Now, in order to do this, we first need to understand a little bit about how a neuron works. Now, an important feature of a neuron is going to be this structure called the axon. And this is where we can actually think about the transmission of a signal occurring. So how does the neuron accomplish this? Well, it has to do with positive and negative charges. You see, normally there's a negative charge along the neuron's membrane on the inside of the cell and a positive charge along the neuron's membrane on the outside of the cell. And this separation of charge means that our axon is polarized and that this is normally the neuron's resting state. So when it's not doing anything, this is how it is. Now, if we were to take a voltage meter and took a reading of the charge inside the neuron, we would see that it's going to measure about negative 70 millivolts. So what's so special about being a polarized axon? Well, it means that it can depolarize. Depolarization occurs when a region of the neuron's membrane momentarily switches its polarity. So that means that a region on the inside becomes positive and a region on the outside becomes negative. And this region is depolarized on our axon. Now, if we look at our graph, we can see that this area of depolarization corresponds with this spike, and that in this region of depolarization, the cell is going to now measure at about a positive 30 millivolts. So how is it that depolarization is used as a means of communication by the neuron? Well, let's take a look at that. Now, in the axon, the depolarization would start at the end adjacent to the cell body, and it's going to work its way all the way to the end of the axon. So this would be the area that depolarizes first, followed by the area next to it, and then the area next to that. Now, right about now, you might be wondering if the entire axon will depolarize and then entirely repolarize, or will just portions depolarize and then repolarize? Well, the answer to that is that portions will depolarize and then repolarize. So as this wave of depolarization creeps along the membrane, the preceding region will repolarize. Now, the current area of depolarization will cause the next adjacent area to depolarize, and then it will repolarize. And this pattern is going to continue all the way down to the end of the axon. And depolarization doesn't stop there. It's actually going to continue all the way down to the end of the axon terminals. Now, the sequential depolarization and repolarization of the neuron cell membrane is how it propagates the action potential. This is how the neuron transmits its impulse that it receives and transmits a message to another cell. So let's put these and a few more concepts together about neuronal communication. So as you can see here, we have our little neuron. Oh, but look, there's another neuron, and it's communicating with our neuron. Well, where these two neurons are in approximation, this is where the communication is going to occur between them. And this area is called a synapse. Now, the orange neuron is going to be sending an impulse, a message, if you will, to our little yellow neuron. Now, of course, anatomists have fancy names for everything, and we're not just going to call the orange neuron. Nay, nay, we're going to call it the presynaptic neuron. So this is the neuron that's showing up before the synapse. And this means that our yellow neuron, we're going to call this one the postsynaptic neuron, the neuron that shows up after the synapse. Well, the region where this occurs, where this communication occurs, where the synapse is located, this is going to be called the receptive region. So this area in blue is our receptive region. This is where the postsynaptic neuron is going to be receiving that impulse from the presynaptic neuron. So what's happening here? Well, the incoming impulse from our presynaptic neuron is actually going to depolarize the membrane of the dendrites. And you might remember the dendrites are the part of the neuron that are capable of receiving an impulse. And then after that impulse is received by the dendrites, it's going to get transmitted along until it makes its way to the membrane of the cell body. And then that impulse is going to move across the membrane of the cell body until it gets roughly right about here. Now, this region is called the Axon Hillock, and we could think of this as a trigger zone, because if the signal is strong enough to have made it to this region, then the rest of everything else I'm about to tell you is definitely going to occur. So the impulse has made it to the axon hillock, and now it's going to start moving down the axon. And this part of the pathway is going to be called the conducting region or the conducting zone, because the impulse that was received by the dendrites is about to be conducted to the other end of the neuron. So here's where we're going to see that sequential depolarization and repolarization of the membrane as this impulse gets transmitted along our dendrite. And we know it doesn't stop here, that it's actually going to make its way all the way to the end of the axon, to the axon terminals. And that what's going to happen here is that the axon terminals are now going to be triggered to release neurotransmitters, which is why we call this region the secretory region. We're going to see the secretion of neurotransmitters. Now, why is this a big deal? Why is the release of these neurotransmitters such a big deal? Well, the reason why is because very likely there is another neuron or maybe another cell that needs to receive the message that our postsynaptic neuron, our little yellow neuron, has to send. So this other cell, this other neuron, is going to be there to receive our neuron's signal. And guess what happens when this cell, our turquoise cell, receives the impulse? You got it. It's going to depolarize that cell, and then more, more transmission of information is going to occur. And this concludes our chat about neuronal communication. Thanks for watching.